In the instant Amelia Madison hurled the worn gift box across the marble floor of her wedding reception, the entire ballroom erupted into laughter aimed at Mason Carter, the quiet man in a faded suit standing at the edge of the aisle. The wealthy bride called him a freeloader, a broke single father unworthy of standing inside her glittering high society wedding. Mason simply knelt and lifted the shattered pocket watch, his eyes calm enough to unsettle everyone nearby. But when his lawyer walked onto the stage and named him owner of everything in that room, the laughter died instantly. Stay until the end to discover why the man everyone mocked most was the one holding every ounce of power. The story began inside a glittering hotel ballroom in the heart of New York, where Amelia Madison and Lucas Owen were preparing to marry in front of the city's wealthiest families. Chandeliers threw soft gold light across marble floors, and rows of white orchids lined the aisle where Amelia would soon walk in a gown that cost more than most people earned in a decade. Every guest on the list belonged to the same glittering world of finance and law and private investment, and every one of them had come expecting a flawless evening built entirely around the image of a perfect couple. Amelia had spent months designing that image, and she wore it like armor. Diamonds traced her collarbone, her hair was set in soft waves, and her smile never wavered whenever a photographer lifted a camera in her direction. Yet behind the gleaming surface, her family's fortune was quietly collapsing. Debts had piled up for years, hidden behind trust funds and borrowed names, and the wedding itself had become less a celebration and more a desperate performance meant to convince a powerful investor that the family was still worth trusting. That investor was Carter Holdings, a company whose chairman never appeared in photographs and never granted interviews, choosing instead to let his attorney, Joseph Aaron, handle every negotiation on his behalf. Amelia had no idea who sat behind that empire, only that her family needed his signature to survive. Lucas, meanwhile, carried a private unease that had nothing to do with money. His half-brother, Mason Carter, a man he had not spoken to in years, had been invited to the wedding at their late father's final request. Samuel David had asked before he passed that his sons find their way back to each other, and Lucas had promised to honor that wish even though guilt and distance had worn the promise thin. Mason arrived that evening exactly as he always did, dressed plainly, traveling alone, carrying nothing that suggested wealth or importance. He was a single father who guarded his private life fiercely, and though little was ever said about the reasons behind that caution, those closest to him understood he protected something far more precious than status. He had not come to prove anything to anyone. He had come only because he had given his word to a father who was no longer alive to see whether that word would be kept. The hotel itself gleamed with the kind of understated luxury that only truly wealthy institutions could afford, its lobby lined with imported marble, its staff trained to anticipate every unspoken need of the guests who passed through its doors. None of the arriving families paid much attention to the details of ownership behind such places, assuming, as people often do, that grandeur simply existed on its own without a particular hand guiding it from somewhere unseen. Mason arrived in an ordinary sedan, parked it himself, and stepped out holding a small box wrapped in paper that had clearly seen better days. His suit, though clean and pressed, showed the faint wear of years of use rather than the crisp shine of something purchased for the occasion. At the entrance, a security guard glanced at him twice before asking for his name again, certain there had been some mistake, since every other guest that evening arrived in a car worth more than most houses. When Mason gave his name a second time, the guard still hesitated, scanning the list as though expecting to find an error. It was Charlotte Hanna, the wedding coordinator, who finally noticed the entry beside his name marking him as a guest of highest priority, and her entire posture shifted the moment she saw it. She moved to escort him inside personally, but Mason declined the gesture with a quiet smile, insisting he was simply family and needed no special treatment. That small exchange planted an unspoken question in Charlotte's mind. Why would a man dressed so plainly carry a designation reserved for the most important guests, one that even the bride herself did not seem aware of? Across the ballroom, Amelia was inspecting the photography setup when she spotted Mason near the entrance. Her expression soured instantly, certain that his presence would ruin the flawless imagery she had spent months curating. Isabella Violet, her closest friend and bridesmaid, leaned in and whispered that the man looked more like a delivery worker than an invited guest, and Amelia did not bother to correct her. Without hesitation, Amelia instructed Charlotte to seat Mason at the farthest table from the cameras, tucked away where none of the important guests would have to look at him. Lucas noticed his brother standing near the doorway but did not approach right away, aware that Amelia was watching his every move with sharp, expectant eyes. Mason saw the hesitation on his brother's face and did not hold it against him. He simply nodded once, the kind of small, resigned gesture of a man long accustomed to being pushed to the edges of his own family's gatherings, and took his seat quietly among strangers who had already decided, without knowing anything real about him, exactly who he was. The table Charlotte led him to sat near a service door, far from the string quartet, and farther still from the polished circle of financiers and attorneys clustered near the head table. A waiter passing by offered him water without meeting his eyes, the same practiced courtesy extended to every guest, yet somehow thinner and quicker where Mason was concerned. He accepted it with a soft word of thanks and set the small wrapped box carefully beside his plate, guarding it the way a man guards something far more valuable than its wrapping would suggest. Nearby, a cluster of guests speculated in hushed tones about who the plain man in the worn suit might be, some guessing a distant cousin, others a hired driver mistakenly seated among paying guests. None of them lowered their voices quite enough, and Mason heard every word, though his expression never shifted. He had spent years learning how to sit inside a room that underestimated him, and tonight required nothing more from him than patience, a quality he had in far greater supply than any of them imagined. Mason sat at his distant table and opened the small box one final time to check its contents before the ceremony began. Inside rested an old pocket watch that had belonged to Samuel David, father to both Mason and Lucas, its glass slightly cracked and its chain worn thin from decades of handling. The watch itself carried no monetary value worth mentioning, yet it remained the single object both brothers had ever shared a memory around, the last physical piece of a father who was no longer there to explain what it meant. Years earlier, Mason had walked away from the family entirely, driven out as much by circumstance as by the quiet disdain of Margaret Grace, Lucas's mother, who had never fully accepted him as anything more than an inconvenient reminder of her husband's life before her. She had treated him, gently but unmistakably, as someone who did not belong among people of real standing, and Mason had absorbed that message long before he understood how untrue it truly was. In the years that followed, Mason built an entire career from nothing, choosing deliberately to keep his success hidden from the world that had once dismissed him. He preferred privacy to recognition, and few people beyond his closest circle knew the scope of what he had quietly built. Lucas, meanwhile, had leaned on his brother more than he ever realized, receiving help through routes he assumed were coincidence rather than design, never suspecting the hand behind so many of his family's quiet rescues. Amelia understood only the surface version of the story, that Lucas had a brother who had drifted into poverty and vanished from polite society long ago. She feared his presence tonight would suggest, to the wrong eyes, that her husband's bloodline carried something beneath their current standing, and that fear shaped every decision she made about where Mason would sit and how visible he would be allowed to become. When Lucas attempted earlier that evening to introduce Mason to a few visiting relatives, Amelia interrupted smoothly, offering a practiced smile as she described him only as an old family acquaintance rather than the groom's own brother. Mason said nothing in response, feeling no need to correct her, since he had not traveled here to reclaim a place inside the family's public image. He had come only to place the watch in Lucas's hands before the ceremony, a final gesture on behalf of a father whose voice could no longer speak for itself, delivered quietly and without expectation of anything returned. He remembered the last conversation he had shared with Samuel, sitting beside a hospital window as the older man pressed the watch into his palm and asked only one thing in return: that his two sons find a way to stand in the same room again without bitterness between them. Mason had promised, and a promise made to a dying father was not one he intended to break, simply because the room in question happened to be filled with strangers who thought poorly of him. He glanced across the ballroom toward Lucas, who stood near the head table looking uneasy in his own wedding finery, caught between the brother he had grown up distant from and the woman who now controlled nearly every choice available to him. Mason felt no anger toward him, only a quiet hope that somewhere beneath the years of separation some thread of the boy he once knew still remained, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Shortly before the ceremony was set to begin, Amelia noticed Mason lingering near the family gathering area, evidently waiting for a chance to speak with Lucas alone. She approached him with a cold, polished smile and asked, in a voice pitched just loud enough for nearby guests to hear, whether he needed money for a taxi ride home. Mason answered calmly that he only wished to give Lucas something before the ceremony started, offering no defense of himself beyond that simple explanation. Amelia glanced down at the worn box in his hands and laughed softly, suggesting he had brought some cheap keepsake in a transparent attempt to seem significant for a single evening. Isabella and a handful of wealthy guests standing nearby joined in, mocking his faded suit, his scuffed shoes, and the plain wrapping of the gift he carried, their laughter rising just enough to draw the attention of others across the room. Amelia's voice sharpened further as she told him plainly that a wedding of this caliber was no place for a failed man seeking pity from people who had already moved far beyond him. Mason remained composed, asking only whether she had ever truly known what Samuel David wanted before he passed away, a question that visibly unsettled her. She bristled at hearing the name spoken aloud, accusing Mason of exploiting a dead man's memory simply to draw sympathy toward himself on a night meant to belong entirely to her. Lucas appeared at that moment, clearly intending to step in, but a single sharp look from Amelia was enough to hold him silent where he stood. Margaret Grace stood nearby as well, visibly uncomfortable, yet she offered no defense of Mason either, embarrassed as always by the plainness of his appearance in front of guests she considered so much more important. Mason understood the weight of their silence perfectly well, and still he did not allow anger to surface in his expression. He extended the box toward Lucas, explaining softly that it held something their father had wanted him to have. Before Lucas could reach for it, Amelia snatched it from Mason's hands in front of everyone watching, tore back the paper, and upon seeing only an old pocket watch inside, let out a short, contemptuous laugh. She announced to the surrounding guests that such an object had no place at a wedding costing a fortune, holding it up as though it were evidence of exactly how little Mason had to offer anyone. In that instant, something in Mason's gaze shifted, subtle but unmistakable, the quiet signal of a man whose patience, however vast, was finally approaching its limit. A few guests near the gathering, sensing the tension, drifted closer under the pretense of admiring the floral displays, eager to witness whatever unfolded next. Isabella whispered something behind her hand to another bridesmaid, and both women exchanged amused glances at Mason's expense, certain that nothing about this quiet, plainly dressed man could possibly threaten the evening's carefully constructed image of wealth and taste. Lucas shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly torn between stepping forward to defend his brother and the fear of provoking Amelia further on the very day meant to secure his future among her family's circle. He opened his mouth once, then closed it again, the words dying somewhere between guilt and cowardice, and Mason noticed the struggle without holding it against him. Margaret's eyes flicked briefly toward the watch in Amelia's hand, and for half a second something like recognition passed across her face, a flicker of memory she pushed down almost as quickly as it surfaced. She had seen that watch decades earlier resting on Samuel's nightstand, though she said nothing of it now, unwilling to complicate an evening already tightening around her son's uneasy silence. The ceremony began beneath glowing chandeliers and towering arrangements of white flowers, though Amelia's irritation lingered beneath her composed smile, unsettled that Mason had not simply left the premises after their earlier exchange. She had instructed Charlotte to seat him behind a decorative column at the very back of the room, positioned deliberately outside the reach of every photographer and videographer capturing the event. Throughout the vows, Lucas kept glancing toward the back of the room, his sense of guilt deepening with every passing minute. When the moment arrived for him to speak about his family, he began to mention his brother by name, only for Amelia to tighten her grip on his hand firmly enough to make him falter and change course entirely. Mason gave no visible reaction to any of it, merely resting his hand over his jacket pocket where a folded copy of his father's final letter remained tucked away, a private anchor amid a room determined to erase him from its story. Once the formal ceremony concluded, guests moved toward the grand reception hall for dinner and toasts. There, Amelia continued asserting her control by moving from table to table, greeting guests warmly, deliberately skipping past Mason's seat as though he did not exist at all. When one curious guest asked why the quiet man near the back sat entirely alone, Amelia answered loudly enough for several tables to hear, describing him as a distant relative going through hard times. The remark drew a wave of glances toward Mason, expressions shifting between pity and quiet disdain, exactly the reaction Amelia had intended to provoke. Isabella added fuel to the moment, remarking with a light laugh that every prominent family seemed to have one relative who appeared at the worst possible times. Mason absorbed every word without responding, his expression unreadable. At that moment, his phone buzzed quietly with a message from Joseph Aaron, confirming that the necessary paperwork was fully prepared and awaiting only his approval to proceed. Mason typed back a brief reply indicating the timing was not yet right. The exchange, unnoticed by anyone else in the room, hinted at something far larger waiting just beneath the surface of the evening, a card Mason held close and had no intention of playing before its proper moment arrived. The unfairness stretched on, course after course, toast after toast, while the room continued underestimating exactly who they were dismissing so easily. Charlotte moved quietly between tables overseeing the service staff, and more than once her gaze drifted toward the man seated behind the column, curiosity building with every small detail that did not add up. She had managed weddings for years and had learned to read the subtle cues that separated a truly wealthy guest from one merely dressed to look the part. And something about Mason's stillness, his unhurried manner, refused to fit the story Amelia kept insisting upon. A server passing dessert plates paused briefly at Mason's table, offering a warmer smile than the earlier staff had shown, and Mason thanked him with the same quiet courtesy he extended to everyone that evening, regardless of how they treated him. Meanwhile, near the head table, Lucas picked at his food without appetite, the weight of his silence pressing harder against his chest with every toast raised in celebration of a future he was no longer certain he wanted. During the toasts, Lucas finally gathered enough courage to speak about his father, telling the room that Samuel David had once hoped his entire family might someday sit together at a single table on his son's wedding day. He turned toward the back of the room, intending to invite Mason forward to share in the toast, but Amelia cut him off in front of every guest present. She declared in a voice sharp enough to silence the room that today belonged to the future and not to digging up memories of past poverty. Mason rose from his seat not to argue, but simply to offer the watch to Lucas properly one final time, in front of the family that had spent the evening pretending he did not belong among them. Amelia snatched the box from his hands and hurled it across the polished marble floor. The watch skidded free of its wrapping, its cracked glass splintering further, the small sound of impact somehow louder than anything else in the room. For a moment the entire hall fell silent, then a ripple of laughter broke out among guests who mistook the scene for nothing more than an embarrassing family squabble. Amelia told Mason plainly that he should understand his place, that a broke single father had no right standing beside wealthy people on such an important night. She continued, implying that his failures were the reason he clung so desperately to his brother's success. Lucas went pale, still lacking the strength to push back against her in front of everyone watching. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, tears rising, yet she could not bring herself to step forward either. Mason bent down and retrieved the broken watch, wiping the dust from its cracked face with a handkerchief pulled from his pocket. He did not look at Amelia as he did it, addressing Lucas instead with a single quiet question, asking whether their father, were he still alive, would have allowed this moment to happen at all. Lucas had no answer to give. Mason turned as if to leave the reception entirely, the watch cradled gently in his palm, but before he reached the doorway, the wide doors at the far end of the hall swung open. Joseph Aaron entered, flanked by two associates carrying a dark leather case between them, his presence immediately drawing every eye in the room. Joseph scanned the crowded hall with calm authority, then addressed Mason directly, using a title that stopped every conversation cold and left the entire gathering staring in stunned confusion at the man they had spent the whole evening dismissing. For a long moment, no one moved. Forks hovered above half-finished plates, and the string quartet, unsure whether to continue playing, let their bows fall still against the strings. Amelia's smile remained frozen on her face, though her eyes had already begun to search the room for some explanation that would make sense of what she had just heard. Isabella grabbed her friend's arm, whispering that surely there had been some mistake, that men who owned anything worth mentioning did not arrive in sedans wearing suits with frayed cuffs. But something in the stillness of the room, in the sudden deference of the waitstaff, in Charlotte's quiet step backward toward the wall, suggested otherwise, and the first cracks of doubt began spreading through the crowd like a slow, spreading chill. Joseph Aaron stepped onto the small stage at the front of the hall, requesting politely that the celebration pause for only a few minutes. Amelia, furious and humiliated, demanded that security remove him at once, but Charlotte intervened immediately, stopping the nearest guard with a firm hand on his arm. Charlotte leaned close and explained quietly that Joseph represented the highest legal authority within Carter Holdings, the very company her family desperately needed to secure an investment from in order to survive. Amelia froze at the words, though she still failed to understand what any of this had to do with the plainly dressed man standing near the back of the room. Joseph turned to face Mason directly and addressed him as the chairman of Carter Holdings. A wave of silence swept across the hall. Several guests recognized the name instantly, aware that Carter Holdings quietly controlled a vast network of hotels, technology firms, investment funds, and prime real estate scattered across the country, a company famous for its secrecy and its refusal to court public attention. Amelia forced a laugh, insisting there had been some confusion, that Mason was simply a distant relation of little consequence to her husband's family. Joseph opened the leather case and produced formal documents confirming that Mason Carter was indeed the founder, majority owner, and controlling shareholder of the entire organization. He revealed further that the very hotel hosting the wedding that evening was owned, through a chain of holding entities, by Mason himself. Every element of the celebration, from the ballroom staff to the security detail to the private suites reserved for honored guests, fell under the quiet management of his company. Amelia clutched at Lucas's arm, demanding to know why he had never told her the truth about his brother. Lucas, trembling, admitted he had never known the full extent of Mason's fortune either. Margaret's mind raced backward through years of unexplained relief, family debts that vanished overnight, legal troubles that resolved themselves without explanation, none of which she had ever connected to the son she had spent decades dismissing. Mason remained composed throughout the revelation, offering no triumphant expression, no satisfaction at the shock rippling across the room. He said only that Joseph need not have made such a display of it. Joseph replied evenly that Amelia had chosen to humiliate his client in front of hundreds of witnesses, and so the truth deserved to be spoken just as openly. Amelia's gaze dropped to the shattered watch still resting in Mason's palm, and for the first time that evening, something like real fear crossed her expression, as she began to understand that the man she had spent hours degrading was the very person her family's survival now depended upon completely. Whispers spread rapidly through the surrounding tables as guests who had laughed loudest only an hour earlier now sat rigid, replaying their own words in their minds and wondering how visible their laughter had been from where Mason had stood. Isabella took several steps backward, releasing Amelia's arm as though distance alone might erase her earlier remarks about delivery workers and misplaced invitations. Charlotte watched the unfolding scene with quiet satisfaction, recalling the instinct she had felt earlier when she noticed his name marked with the highest designation on her guest list. She had learned over many years managing events for the wealthy that true power rarely announced itself through appearance, and tonight had proven that lesson more vividly than any evening she could remember. Lucas stood frozen beside his bride, caught between the crumbling image of the wife he was about to marry and the brother he had allowed himself to overlook for far too long, the weight of years of quiet neglect suddenly pressing down on him all at once. Joseph continued speaking, revealing the piece of information that mattered most that evening. Amelia's family desperately needed Carter Holdings to finalize an investment worth hundreds of millions of dollars in order to rescue their crumbling business. From the beginning, Amelia had presented herself as the daughter of a wealthy dynasty, yet in truth her family's assets were on the verge of being seized by lenders who had long since lost patience. The lavish wedding itself had been staged largely to project an illusion of enduring power, meant to reassure a nervous investor that the family remained as formidable as its reputation suggested. Amelia's contempt for Mason had never been solely about assuming he was poor. It reflected something deeper, a desperate need to eliminate any element that might undermine the polished image she required to secure her family's future. Joseph explained that Mason had deliberately withheld his final signature on the agreement, choosing instead to observe firsthand how the family treated someone they believed held no power or standing at all. Amelia's face drained of color as she scrambled to soften her tone, insisting the entire evening had simply been a misunderstanding born from wedding day stress and nothing more. Mason said nothing, allowing her scramble for composure to expose itself fully in front of the crowd. Isabella retreated further still, no longer willing to stand visibly beside the bride she had spent the evening flattering. Murmurs rippled through the surrounding tables as guests exchanged glances, many of them realizing with quiet embarrassment how quickly they had joined in mocking a man about whom they knew absolutely nothing. Lucas felt a wave of shame rise in his chest at how easily he had allowed Amelia to belittle his own brother throughout the evening. Margaret stepped forward hesitantly and attempted an apology to Mason, though the words caught in her throat, weighed down by years of quietly viewing him as unworthy of the family name. Mason did not offer forgiveness immediately, though neither did he turn his anger toward her. He said the issue was never about whether the watch itself carried monetary value, but about the willingness with which Amelia had trampled the memory of a father who was no longer alive to defend himself. Amelia bent down and reached for the broken box lying on the floor, attempting to salvage some appearance of remorse in front of the watching crowd, but Mason gently stopped her before she could lift it. He told her quietly that certain things, once cast aside in front of an entire room, could not simply be retrieved with a practiced smile and a hurried apology. Joseph placed the investment agreement onto a nearby table, waiting patiently while Mason considered his next move, the entire wedding now suspended in tense anticipation of whatever decision he was about to make. Several guests near the head table quietly gathered their belongings, sensing the evening had shifted into something far more consequential than a family celebration. though none dared leave outright while the tension in the room remained so thick. A photographer who had spent the night ignoring Mason entirely under Amelia's earlier instructions now lifted his camera toward him without hesitation, uncertain whether to apologize for the oversight or simply pretend it had never happened. Seated, Front rose halfway from his chair, his own composure crumbling as the true scale of his daughter's desperation became visible to every investor and colleague in attendance. He had believed the wedding might buy his family a little more time. Instead, it had exposed the very fragility he had hoped to conceal, laid bare in front of the exact people whose confidence he could least afford to lose. Lucas stared at the agreement resting on the table, then at Mason, and finally understood that for years he had lived under the quiet protection of a brother he had once pushed away without a second thought. Memories surfaced rapidly, family debts that vanished overnight, a struggling venture of his own that had somehow been rescued at exactly the right moment, none of it ever explained, all of it now suddenly clear. Mason had never once asked for credit or gratitude for any of it. He had simply acted quietly from a distance, expecting nothing in return. And yet Lucas had allowed Amelia to treat that same brother like an unwelcome stain on their wedding day, a thought that settled over him now with heavy, undeniable weight. Lucas walked toward Mason and knelt to gather the broken shards of glass scattered near his feet. The gesture, small as it was, silenced the hall completely, since it marked the first moment all evening that Lucas had stood visibly beside his brother rather than beside his bride. Amelia grabbed his arm, reminding him sharply that without her family's connections, he risked losing his place among the very circles that mattered most in their world. Lucas turned to face her fully and asked what kind of standing required him to stay silent while his own brother was humiliated in front of everyone they knew. Amelia's composure finally broke. She snapped that he had no right to ruin her life over a man dressed in a worn suit, the true controlling instinct beneath her polished exterior surfacing at last for the entire room to witness. The words landed harder than she intended, and in that instant, Lucas felt the last of his hesitation disappear entirely. He reached down and removed his wedding ring, not because Mason had demanded it of him, but because he could no longer imagine building a life beside someone who measured human worth by the cost of a suit or the size of a bank account. Amelia's panic rose sharply. She turned toward Mason instead, pleading that whatever punishment he intended for her personally, he should not allow it to destroy the investment agreement her family so desperately needed. Mason answered evenly that she alone had unraveled everything the moment she chose to humiliate a person she assumed could never fight back. There was no cruelty in his voice, only quiet certainty, the kind that comes from a man who no longer needs to raise his tone to be taken seriously. The room watched in stunned silence as the wedding they had gathered to celebrate quietly dissolved before them, not through any dramatic act of vengeance from Mason, but through the simple unraveling of choices Amelia herself had made, one after another, throughout the entire evening. Margaret moved closer to her son, uncertain whether to comfort him or apologize to the man she had spent so many years overlooking, and settled instead for standing quietly beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. She said nothing, but something in her posture had softened, the rigid pride she had carried for decades finally giving way beneath the weight of everything she had just witnessed. Isabella slipped toward the edge of the room, no longer certain where her loyalties belonged, now that the woman she had spent months flattering stood exposed before every important guest in attendance. A few of the wealthier attendees exchanged quiet glances, already recalculating their own future dealings with a family whose fortune had just been revealed as far less solid than its reputation suggested. Everyone in the room expected Mason to tear the investment agreement apart as an act of pure retaliation. Amelia herself believed he would destroy her family completely on the spot, using the very power that had just been revealed to crush whatever remained of their reputation. Mason, however, did not act out of impulse. He asked Joseph to revise the terms of the agreement rather than cancel it outright. Carter Holdings would no longer invest in preserving Amelia's family's control over the business, but it would protect the innocent employees who depended on their jobs, ensure every unpaid wage was settled in full, and restructure the company so that no one beneath the family lost their livelihood because of decisions they had no part in making. Amelia's family lost their position of authority within the company, not through a personal act of revenge, but because they had concealed mounting debts and used a carefully staged image to deceive an investor who trusted them. Mason did not destroy Amelia through some dramatic act of retribution. Instead, he simply removed the one thing she valued most, the illusion of power built entirely on appearance. Mason also instructed that every member of the hotel's staff be paid in full for their work that evening, ensuring no one behind the scenes suffered because a wedding had fallen apart in front of hundreds of witnesses. Charlotte felt a wave of quiet emotion at hearing this, having rarely witnessed a man of such enormous wealth show genuine concern for the people working unseen behind an event of this scale. Mason turned to Lucas and told him he did not need to choose a side in any of this, only that from this point forward he needed to stand for what was right rather than what was convenient. Lucas apologized to Mason in front of the entire hall, his voice unsteady but sincere. Margaret offered her own apology as well, admitting that for years she had judged Mason by his clothing and his humble beginnings rather than by the man he had actually become. Mason did not embrace either of them immediately, though he nodded once, a small gesture that left the door to reconciliation open rather than closed. Amelia stood alone in the middle of the lavish hall, still dressed in her extravagant gown, yet entirely isolated from everyone around her. She finally understood that the man she had spent the entire evening calling poor and unworthy had been the only person in the room who behaved with any real dignity. Mason picked up the shattered watch, held it gently in his palm and walked away from the stage, leaving behind him a wedding that had once promised grandeur and now stood dissolving quietly into silence, its guests scattering in hushed, uncertain conversation. Joseph gathered the revised documents into his leather case, offering Amelia's father a brief professional nod before following Mason toward the exit, his associates trailing quietly behind him. Waitstaff began clearing untouched plates from tables where guests had already begun slipping away, whispering among themselves about what they had just witnessed and how quickly the evening's glittering promise had come undone. Outside the ballroom doors, the city noise of New York carried faintly through the marble corridor, indifferent to the ruin unfolding behind it. Mason paused for a moment near the entrance, glancing back once at the hall where a life he had once belonged to had finally, however painfully, told the truth about itself before stepping out into the cool evening air alone. In the weeks that followed, word of the collapsed wedding spread quickly through high society circles, though Mason refused to let journalists exploit any part of his private life. He declined every request for an interview, preferring to remain the same quietly guarded figure he had always been, unwilling to trade his privacy for public attention he had never wanted in the first place. Carter Holdings took over Amelia's family business through entirely lawful means, retaining employees who had genuine skill and removing those who had participated in years of dishonest practices. Amelia lost her position as a celebrated figure within her social circle, and for the first time in her adult life she faced an existence stripped entirely of the admiration she had always taken for granted. She eventually sent Mason a letter of apology, though he did not respond right away. That silence felt honest rather than cruel, a reminder that not every wound heals within the span of a single dramatic evening. Lucas began rebuilding his own life, distancing himself from the hollow relationships he had clung to for years and learning slowly to build something of his own rather than borrowing status from those around him. Margaret sought Mason out on her own terms, arriving without excuses or justifications, carrying instead a small repaired box meant to hold the watch properly. Mason accepted the gift quietly, telling her that the watch had never needed to be flawless in order to hold meaning for him. The larger truth of the story settled gradually over everyone involved. Genuine wealth was never measured by the extravagance of a wedding or the size of a guest list, but by the character a person carried when they were stripped of every advantage others believed defined them. Mason's private life remained mostly his own, guarded carefully as always, though one quiet detail lingered near the story's end. He returned home late one evening, noticing the soft glow of a lamp still lit in his living room, and remembered in that instant exactly why he had always chosen quiet privacy over public recognition. No scene followed to dwell on it further, only that single small image offered briefly before the story moved on. Mason placed the broken watch in a drawer inside his desk, a quiet keepsake of his father, of a family finally beginning to heal, and of an entire room that had learned, however painfully, what true worth actually looked like. Charlotte, for her part, found herself thinking often of that evening long after the last guest had departed, of the plainly dressed man she had almost overlooked entirely, and the lesson his quiet dignity had left behind for everyone who witnessed it. The story closed in a quiet space far removed from the extravagance of that ruined wedding, a private office at dawn, a warm home, an empty hotel corridor long after the last guest had gone. Mason did not smile with triumph, since destroying Amelia had never been his purpose. He had only wanted to protect his father's memory, preserve his own dignity, and give Lucas a real chance to grow into someone better. Lucas eventually sent him a short message, admitting he was sorry for staying silent for so long. Mason read it but did not answer immediately, and that pause felt honest, since forgiveness was never something that arrived all at once. Joseph later reported that every remaining term had been settled, and that the employees of Amelia's former company were fully protected. Mason answered simply that this was the part that mattered most. The story ended with the image of a broken watch still ticking after a temporary repair, a quiet symbol of a family once shattered but never entirely without hope. Never judge a person by a worn suit, a modest gift, or the silence they choose to carry in front of a crowd, for some people need not prove their power until the truth itself forces the whole world to notice. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that quiet people often carry the loudest kind of strength.